This is a training that I did when I first started doing trainings. And I wanted to revisit it because I feel like this is a topic that comes up a lot. And my goal today with the training about resentment is really to validate you all and to hopefully eliminate some shame that maybe could surround that feeling of resentment that you can have as a caregiver, because it's a very common experience, but I think it's one that we don't like to admit to ourselves, especially not to others. And so this will be an opportunity for you to just fully accept that resentment as part of the journey, and also give you some tips on how you can kind of mitigate some of that so that you aren't so stressed and so that you're not heaping more shame and more guilt and more anger on top of yourself. So the goal here today is really to just normalize these feelings for you. And also at the end, I want to give you all some space to have conversation. I do record these trainings and they are posted online, but I will pause it. I'll pause the recording at the end of my presentation so that you can be free to have those conversations, and they won't be recorded and they won't be shared online, okay? So let's go ahead and get into it. If you participated last year when I did this training, I did add a little bit more information to it. So it'll be a recap, but then there is a little bit extra information in there as well. So what is resentment? So resentment is an intense and multi-layered emotion, right? It has several components, one of which is anger, right? Bitterness, indignation, sadness, humiliation, and shame. All of that is kind of encompassed in resentment. Now, you may feel all of those things. You may feel a few of those things. You may just feel one of those things. But resentment is kind of like a buildup of some of those quote unquote negative emotions. And as we go through this, I want you to really understand that from my perspective, from a mental health perspective, I don't believe there's a such thing as a negative emotion. I do believe that there are negative ways to express emotion, but I feel every feeling that we feel serves a purpose. And most of those feelings are, the purpose is self-preservation. Okay, when we're talking about anger and fear and things like that, a lot of that is about self-preservation. So I don't want you to think, well, I'm angry and this is wrong. Okay, anger is not wrong. It's just how do we express it, okay? So in general terms, resentment will arise when you feel like you've been treated unfairly, or you've been devalued, disrespected, or if somebody's like dismissing your identity or your perspective. And that can happen a lot in caregiving, especially if you've been doing it for a long time. It seems like all you do is caregive, right? That's your identity. And so kind of losing part of your identity as an individual can definitely lead to resentment. And so just like any emotion, resentment has a lot of range, right? And it typically will stretch to whatever magnitude that feels matched to the insult. So if you can feel a little bit resentful over little things, and you can feel a lot resentful over big things, right? So there's really no one way to feel resentment. So resentment is not a pure emotion. It is a particular manifestation of anger. And resentment is persistent anger that builds up when there's no outlet for feeling that frustration or that hurt. And the graphic I chose for this presentation is the canyon, because, if you didn't sleep through fifth grade geology or whatever geography class, you know that is resulted from like a slow funnel, basically, of water that just wears that rock down over time. And that's what resentment is. It is when you don't have that outlet for your fear or your frustration or your anger or your hurt, it can definitely create those chasms, right, in our lives. Feeling anger and resentful, this is very important. It doesn't mean that you don't love the person that you're taking care of, right? And it doesn't mean that you're awful at being a caregiver. And it doesn't mean that you're a terrible person. It just means that you're a human being. So congratulations. If you feel resentment, you have passed the test. You're not a cyborg, you are a human being. Right? So a variety of things can cause resentment, right? It can happen when you feel like you've been taken advantage of, or when you feel like you've been mistreated, or you aren't being heard. And I think for me, I don't know if it's the same for you, but when you're constantly meeting the needs of other people, it can become very difficult to feel heard in those spaces, but that your own needs aren't being met as well. And it's often defined as a feeling of indignation. So unfortunately, resentment can unleash other destructive thoughts and emotions. And resentment could ultimately poison relationships if it's left unchecked. So some causes of caregiver resentment, feeling overwhelmed or invisible, being exhausted or feeling unfulfilled. It can come from sacrifices such as giving up a job or putting other relationships or your own well-being on the back burner. And I've joked before, sometimes you can't even put your well-being on the back burner. It's not even on the stove, right? And it can sprout from one too many things going wrong, right? Like challenging family dynamics, the difficulty of a loved one's care, or even their combative nature. If you have a loved one who's maybe not receiving the care in a very kind and gentle way, maybe they're combative, that can be very frustrating and cause resentment. And in regard to other people, because I know sometimes you're doing this caregiving journey on your own, and maybe there are other family members, siblings, or maybe you have children or something like that, and they're not doing their fair share. They're not helping. Some of these resentment or some of these causes of resentment can be in relations related to those type of relationships. So jealousy, maybe you're jealous because your brother doesn't have to stay with mom like you do, right? Betrayal. Maybe you feel betrayed because somebody that said they were going to be helpful, they haven't been, right? Embarrassment, shame, trauma, sharing your needs and not having them met. So, if you've told somebody, hey, I need a break, and they are not listening to you, that could be definitely a cause for resentment. Not sharing your needs and not having them met. So sometimes we keep our needs to ourselves and we don't tell people what we need, but we still build resentment against somebody, and they might not be even aware that that's happening. Not identifying and setting boundaries or having them violated, right? Communicating boundaries and having them violated. Hoping someone will read your mind and then becoming resentful or upset that they don't. Okay, so again, you might not feel all of these things, but these are some causes of caregiver resentment. So what are the signs? It can be tricky to recognize the signs of resentment because it is such a multi-layered emotion, and it can combine a myriad of feelings at the same time. But overall, a resentful person, you feel like you've been wronged in some way. And that's, again, when I say like there's no such thing as a bad emotion. Anger, resentment, that kind of shows up when you feel as if like a boundary has been crossed or an offense has been made, or you feel the need to protect yourself. Okay, so it serves a purpose. It definitely does. And so we need to recognize the signs of those feelings so that we can address the purpose it's serving, and then we can address how to healthily express those emotions. Okay, so if you are feeling resentful, some of the signs: you might be tense when you're around a person who you believed has wronged them, and that could be your care recipient, that could be other people in your family. You might avoid conflict with that person. Maybe you say, well, I really like for my brother to come and help with mom, but every time I bring it up, he blows me off, and so I'm just not going to talk to him about it anymore. I'm just going to sit and stew, right? Ruminating obsessively and not being able to stop thinking about how they have wronged you. You might talk badly about them behind their back, right? You can maybe refuse to admit that you're upset or talk about that situation at all. How many times have you done that? No, I'm fine. I'm fine. It's not a big deal. It's fine. And it's not. And it is a big deal, right? Maybe you're pulling away emotionally or physically from someone that you feel resentment toward. Okay, so you can see sometimes these signs are just how you're choosing to interact now with that person. And feelings that may contribute to, or it may indicate you're feeling resentment: sadness, disappointment, frustration, hostility or hard feelings and anger. Maybe you're feeling bitter or fearful, blaming or self-blaming, feeling guilty or less than or not enough. A lot of times we will internalize these things, right? Regret or injustice or imbalance in the relationship. And that could not necessarily just have to be with the person you're giving care to, but again, people in your circle who maybe you feel could be doing more to assist the situation. And there's that imbalance there that can definitely lead to feelings of resentment. So it's important for us to identify what triggers these feelings of resentment, right? What's the source? So to identify the source of your resentment, you can consider how your needs may have been written off or how they've gone unmet in a relationship or friendship or, in your caregiving relationships. If you're constantly giving to another person without feeling as though it's being reciprocated, resentment can brood in rather sneakily. So especially if you know you're caring for someone who cannot reciprocate, right? They cannot meet your needs in the same way that you are meeting theirs. And that's okay. That's the job, right? But over time, if we are not having our needs met in some way, whether that's through another person coming in and giving us a break, or respecting our own boundaries with ourselves and allowing ourselves to have that rest, resentment can build up. Even if you're not feeling resentful about the job you're doing, right? You might not be feeling resentful of caregiving in and of itself. But over time, if you constantly abandon yourself and you don't meet your needs, it can build up. So you might not feel resentful in the beginning of your caregiving journey, but if you start to feel like you're regularly compromising for another person, even if they can't help it, right, that feeling can emerge. So that's why it's very important to recognize the signs of resentment. So especially if you've expressed your concerns to somebody else, right? I need some help. I need a break. And they're continuing to ignore you, that resentment, as opposed to like anger or occasional annoyance, that will build up, right? And so not only when you feel like your needs haven't been met, but particularly when you have been clear and consistent in expressing that need and somebody's deliberately ignoring you, that's a surefire way to feel resentful. So that scenario can crack open deep emotional wounds surrounding fears of not being good enough or being abandoned, and that can lead to even greater resentment. And so the same goes for being regularly belittled by somebody, right? If you're taking care of maybe a parent who maybe cognitively is different, or maybe they've kind of always been a belittling kind of person, and you guys have always kind of had a very tense relationship, and now you're caregiving for them, and they're still doing those behaviors. They're still belittling you. They're still tearing you down and saying, "Oh, you're being too sensitive," right? That kind of stuff. That can definitely spark some resentment, right? So not only are they failing to take responsibility for pain or shame that they're causing you, but they're also failing to see and appreciate the wholeness of who you are. And so this might not apply to you, but there are some people in the group who have shared that they have, difficult parents that maybe aren't as kind. And so that can definitely build resentment when you're taking care of somebody who isn't very kind to you, and yet you just have to kind of swallow it down and do what needs to be done. That's a recipe for disaster. That's a recipe for resentment for sure. So as I go through these, just kind of start taking like a mental checklist of like this, yeah, this is happening to me. I feel this is happening, and maybe start to identify those things that trigger that resentment in your own situation. So it's important to recognize resentment as a normal reaction to taking on additional caregiving responsibilities, okay? So I hope, if nothing else, by the end of this, you see that resentment is not, it's not a character flaw, okay? It's part of the deal. It's part of the package, okay? But if it's left unchecked, resentment can become destructive and impact everyone in damaging ways, right? So that's why it's essential to identify and address it before it spirals out of control. So please remember that even the most compassionate caregivers experience frustration and anger because they're simply part of that caregiving experience, right? Because if you think about it, there's going to be an imbalance. You are always going to be giving more than you're receiving in a caregiving relationship. Okay. And so to feel resentful, to feel overwhelmed, to feel overlooked, that's just going to be part of it. Now, it's not anybody's fault, right? You're not bad for feeling that way, and your loved one isn't bad for needing care. Okay. We just have to acknowledge and identify this is part of the journey. Okay. So I want you to think about one of the more recent times, or maybe one of the most prominent times that you can think of, or maybe you let your anger or your resentment get out of control, right? Maybe you didn't respond in the way that you wanted to, or maybe you kept it all to yourself, but it was still ruminating in there. And I want you to kind of think about that situation as I go through these questions, okay? So what was the triggering situation? Okay. What thoughts or what emotions were involved? How did you react? And here's an important part. Were your physical needs met? Were you hungry? Were you tired? Were you in a lot of pain that day? Because a lot of you are lifting and moving and crouching and stooping, and it's a hard, painful job that you're doing. And when we're hungry or tired or in pain, okay, that can definitely trigger a poor reaction. How full was your cup before you poured from it? Were you running on E? And then what was the outcome? And I'm just going to guess, if you lost your cool, the outcome was not that great. So the next question is, can you show yourself some compassion? Okay. So resentment has an intense effect on the brain, right? If we ruminate over feelings of resentment or that interaction that brought it on, it can flood the brain with stress hormones, and that makes us more susceptible to negative thoughts. And that thought process then, paradoxically, makes it more difficult to concentrate and identify effective ways to resolve that injury that was caused in the first place, right? So what does that result in? More bitterness, okay? So again, not identifying the triggers, not identifying and validating those feelings, not expressing them in healthy ways, it just continues the cycle of more resentment and more anger and more frustration, okay? Avoiding emotions never makes them go away, okay? It just gives them a space to grow. So avoid resentment by accepting your anger. And I know this is tough for a lot of us, especially if you've been socialized in a space where anger is a bad thing, right? We don't want to lose our cool. We don't want to be frustrated. We don't want to set boundaries, okay? It can be very difficult to accept our anger and not want to run away from it or feel shame, okay? So allowing yourself the space to be angry, that is actually a form of self-care. Okay, because chronic anger and resentment have been linked to all kinds of health problems, right? Migraines, sleeping disorders, eating disorders, digestive tract disorders, high blood pressure, heart attacks, heart disease, the list goes on, right? And the long-term buildup of negative emotions can lead to mental health issues like depression and anxiety, that feeling of helplessness, isolation, and loneliness, okay? And these are all very common expressions that caregivers have, right? A lot of times you're feeling depressed or you're feeling isolated, okay? And if you don't allow yourself that space to release that anger or even validate or acknowledge that anger, you're just creating a space where it's gonna, in the long run, cause more problems for you. So I like to think of emotions as energy in motion. So we're often socialized to suppress our feelings, to swallow our words, to hold back anger and grief, and not prioritize our needs for pleasurable experiences. And so if you've got this energy in you, right, you've got these emotions in you, and you're not allowing that emotion to flow normally and naturally the way it's supposed to, and you're holding it back or you're swallowing it down, think of it like if you have like a soda bottle and you got the cap on and you shake it, right? There's all that pressure building up. And then when you pop the top, what happens? It explodes, right? That's exactly how emotions are in our body. If we don't have a good, healthy release for them, it will eventually just explode and make a big mess, right? So we can verbalize our anger or our frustration. So we can talk to a trusted friend. We can participate in a support group, right? You can have a counselor or a therapist help you process through some of that. Or if nothing else, you can journal, right? Just sometimes writing it down can make you, give it a space to land so it's not spinning around in your body. And here's a quote: "The greatest remedy for anger is delay." So one way that I stop anger in its track is through breathing exercises, okay? Counting, right? Counting backwards from 10, taking a time out, or having a personal mantra or mantra, however you want to pronounce it. It's kind of one of those things that takes a lot of practice, right? Because the explosion of anger or the reaction to anger can be very impulsive, right? But if we can start thinking more along the lines of, how do I slow this down? How do I respond rather than react? This is a practice, though. I don't want you to feel like, well, I'm just going to take a couple deep breaths and I'll be fine. But what that breathing does is it gives you a moment to stop and consider your reaction, okay? And then you can vent it out. Physical releases like screaming or punching into a pillow, right? Singing or dancing, walking around the block, exercise, something physical that you can do. And you might feel silly grabbing a couch cushion and screaming into it, but it's a good way for you to release that energy without it being destructive, okay? So some strategies to help you manage resentment. Some of these might seem like common sense to you. You may have already tried some of these, but some of them may be brand new to you. So the first thing you can do is develop self-compassion. I am a huge advocate for self-compassion. I think that we as a whole are just way too hard on ourselves. I mean, just even the whole theme of this is anger and resentment, right? And we feel shame and we're hard on ourselves for feeling these normal, natural human emotions, okay? So even right there, you can give yourself some self-compassion. So being resentful is really kind of like a coping mechanism, right? And it works short term, but in the long run, it's not going to be very beneficial, as we went through some of those previously. So be kind to yourself, right? You're a human being and you make mistakes. So it's okay. Maybe you didn't react the way that you wanted to, but you're working toward being a better responder and less of a reactor, right? View the situation with empathy. So when you take the viewpoint of the other person and see the situation from their perspective, you might have a different take on what's happening, right? Sometimes we can feel resentful about a situation and take it out on a person who's part of that situation, but it's not their fault, right? So your loved one didn't ask to be in a caretaking or in a care receiving role, right? That's just where they ended up. And so it can be okay for you to be resentful for having to be a caregiver, but you don't have to be resentful toward the person who needs the care, right? So we can view that situation with empathy and say they didn't want to be in the situation any more than I did, right? Forgiving yourself and others, a lot of times easier said than done. And it might be hard to let go of that resentment or making peace with somebody that maybe isn't doing their fair share of the work. But it does help with increasing that sense of well-being and your sense of purpose in life, right? A lot of times we make mistakes and we get forgiven for them and we can grow from it. And sometimes it's just nice to kind of pass that along to other people and especially ourselves, right? Reflect and identify the source of your resentment. So if it is something that you can address through clear communication, practice doing so. Communicate your needs and your boundaries and requests. If the resentment is stemming from a situation that's out of your control, acknowledge the feelings arising from that, like grief or rage, and then practice acceptance and focusing on what you can control once that feeling has been processed, okay? So again, it's not about squishing those feelings down. It's allowing yourself to feel them and then being able to process them and move forward in a healthy way, okay? You can embrace a new perspective. So it's really tough to figure out how to let go of resentment when you're really deep in it, right? You have that, you can't see the forest for the trees or whatever that saying is. So reframing our thoughts from the perspective of an outside party, mediating a relationship between yourself and your resentment. So you can ask the resentment, what are you trying to show me? What are you trying to tell me about this relationship or this situation? And how are you using your voice or are you not using your voice to express what you hope for, right? What you're hoping. Sometimes we can build a lot of resentment because we don't speak up, right? So it's important to say if you can speak up, if you can communicate, then you have the right to do that. And this one I think is very important. Explore the softer emotions of resentment. So resentment can show up as anger outwardly, right? You're upset, you're frustrated, you don't feel valued, right? But softer emotions like the fear of your needs going unmet, that's often the root of the issue, okay? So sometimes we can project our fear as anger, and that's not gonna really solve anything, right? So I think it's important to kind of dig down and say, what is the anger trying to tell me? What is the anger protecting me from? And more often than not, we can boil almost all of these emotions down to fear. Fear of losing something, fear of getting taken advantage of, fear of not being fulfilled, right? So it's important to kind of sit with those feelings and ask them, what are you trying to show me? What's going on here, okay? It might seem uncomfortable at first, but just think, this is you. This is who you are. This is, you know, your spirit, your soul, whatever. Don't be afraid of it, right? Just try to get to understand yourself a little bit more. So here's a good way that I found to really work on building up resilience to resentment. And the way I combat that feeling of anger or frustration or resentment is by countering it with love or kindness. Okay. So there's something called a meta practice or loving kindness practice, and or you can call it a meditation. And so during this process, you recite positive phrases towards yourself and other people, because I really do feel that love, kindness, and compassion, it starts with the self, with the individual, right? If you can't show yourself love, kindness, and compassion, you might be shortchanging other people in your life of the full love, kindness, and compassion that you could offer them, right? So getting to know that in and of ourselves first is a great way to be able to expand that to others. And so that's what a meta practice or a meditation will do for you. So the practice aims to foster a mental state of kindness, love, and compassion. And when done regularly, meta meditation can help minimize negative emotions towards yourself and others. And so the first thing you do is you start with yourself. And you can say something very similar to what I have on the screen here. May I be safe. May I be happy. May I be healthy. May I live in peace. May my heart fill with love. And may my whole being fill with kindness. And then the next part of that is think of somebody that you are fond of, that you're in a good relationship with, right? Maybe a spouse, a child, a friend. And you do the same thing, but you say, may you be safe. May you be happy. May you be healthy, right? And you're putting that kindness out to that person. And then if you get really courageous, you can think of somebody that maybe you don't know very well, right? Like a coworker or a neighbor, and do the same to that person, right? And then if you're feeling really, really brave, you can think of somebody that you don't really like at all, who irks your nerves, right? Who you don't really feel any kind or loving feelings toward, and do the same for them, okay? And really the goal here is to show you that yes, you can extend loving kindness and compassion outward to people you care about, but you can also do it to yourself inwardly, and you can also share that to people you don't really like, okay? And this, again, it's just cultivating that practice, that inner kindness. So that way, when you do reach that point of feeling angry or resentful, your muscles for kindness and your muscles for compassion have been strengthened, right? And so you can address that a little bit in the way more likely that you'd like to. So I know this is a short one, but I think it's good for us to have space to have a conversation. If you do find that you are really reaching a boiling point, right, and you have to find a healthy way to release that, and you need to talk to somebody, there are crisis lines that you can call. This one is North Alabama, but they take calls from all over the nation, and it's the Crisis Services Helpline, and that's 256-716-1000. Before I started working here, I used to work with crisis services. I was a suicide prevention educator. I was also a crisis counselor, and I answered this helpline a lot. Okay. And so this line is completely confidential. The only way that they would break confidentiality, like most places, would be if you were going to say that you're going to harm yourself or harm another person. But really, the helpline is designed just to give you a space with a trained, compassionate, listening ear. Sometimes people will call because they feel lonely. Sometimes people will call because they're feeling suicidal, okay? There's a wide range of reasons why people call, and the people on those lines are trained to respond and react in a way that's compassionate and empathetic and caring, okay? So don't ever feel like, well, my problem's not big enough to call the crisis line. Yeah, it is. It's fine. You can call. I would have people call me just to play a song that they wrote because they didn't have anybody else to share it with, right? So you could just call and say, I'm having a bad day and I want to punch a wall, right? So I called you instead, and they're fine with that. The next, of course, is the National Suicide Hotline, which is 988. And this is something I think people are afraid to call because they think, well, I'm not actively suicidal. But you can definitely call this line if you're feeling depressed, if you're feeling isolated, because a lot of those feelings, if they're left unchecked or if they're left unacknowledged, they can very quickly spiral into a very major depressive situation, okay? So if you feel like you need to talk to somebody, call the National Suicide Hotline. Again, trained people. They know all about, what you're going to say to them. So don't be ashamed or embarrassed to call them. And then, of course, you can call me. This is my work number, 256-859-8300. Again, I'm a social worker. I'm a trained counselor or crisis counselor. And so if you need to call and vent and you want to schedule a care chat, I'm available for you. So the key takeaways that I want you to remember before I end my presentation and we start our conversation. Anger is normal, okay? And it is a natural response to the demands of caregiving. And in a lot of cases, there are high demands and they continue to get higher and higher and higher as the journey progresses, right? So how you started is not going to be how you ended it. And so if you start to feel angry, if you start to feel resentful, if you start to feel frustrated, please know that's normal, okay? And there are really healthy ways that you can express those feelings. They're not bad in and of themselves, okay? Anger that is not released in healthy ways turns into resentment over time. Shaming ourselves compounds difficult emotions and only make things worse, right? So if you say, I shouldn't be angry, I shouldn't be resentful, I shouldn't feel frustrated. Yes, you should. Yes, you should. That's part of it, right? And so shaming ourselves for that is not going to make it any better. It's going to make it worse. And also, we can develop healthy strategies to help us cultivate emotional resilience. And I do want to drive this point home. This is not an overnight process, okay? We have to first acknowledge how we feel, and we have to find healthy ways to process how we feel. And the last thing that is going to be helpful to us is ignoring our normal human responses to incredibly stressful and frustrating situations, okay? And you can develop these healthy strategies, but you have to give yourself compassion. You have to give yourself grace because you will mess up more than you succeed in the very beginning, okay? But success is definitely waiting for you. You just have to be able to give yourself that empathy and that compassion while you learn it. So that is my presentation. I know it was shorter than normal. But again, I wanted to make sure that we had time to have a conversation. So I'll stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to check the chat real quick in case anybody said anything. So I'll go ahead and pause our recording